Today, we're diving into the incredibly complex, often contradictory life of John Quincy Adams. You know, when we think of the founding era, we usually picture marble statues and these really simple, heroic narratives. But the truth? It's way more fascinating. We're talking about a guy whose public service spanned an unfathomable amount of time, literally from witnessing the American Revolution all the way to the brink of the Civil War. Born in 1767 to Abigail and John Adams, almost his entire existence was absolutely consumed by public service. To really wrap our heads around his massive impact, just consider a career stretching across almost 80 years of relentless dedication. He wasn't just sitting on the sidelines watching the nation evolve, he was one of its primary architects. From his birth in 1767 to his final days in the U.S. Capitol in 1848, you really get a sense of how long this man was in the room where it happened. But as we follow this timeline, we're also going to track a deeply personal conflict that perfectly mirrored the nation's own struggles. See, history remembers John Quincy Adams as this fierce, vocal opponent of slavery. But the reality of his everyday life? Well, it presents a much more complicated picture, and that's exactly what we're going to unpack today. And why does this matter? Because looking closely at Adams helps us understand just how deeply embedded the institution of slavery was in early America, even for the very people who fought against it politically.
Part 1. America's Greatest Diplomat.
Just look at his early years. Starting at only 10 years old, Adams traveled to Europe with his dad to begin his diplomatic training. While most kids his age were, just playing outside, he was attending school abroad, mastering French, Dutch, and German. By 1781, he's heading to Russia to serve as a secretary and translator for diplomat Francis Dana. 2 years later, he's in Paris, acting as his father's official secretary during the actual negotiations that ended the Revolutionary War. All of this incredible, world-shaping experience happened before he even returned home in 1785 to quickly finish up his training and graduate from Harvard. Absolutely wild. And all that early experience built into a seriously unstoppable career. He spent a little time as a lawyer, but President George Washington quickly tapped him to be U.S. Minister to Holland. From there, he rapidly climbed the ranks. He served under his own father in Prussia, which, by the way, is where he married Louisa Catherine Johnson and they had 4 kids. Later, after a brief stint in the Senate, where he actually bucked his own party to side with Thomas Jefferson on the Louisiana Purchase, President James Madison appointed him as the first official U.S. minister to Russia. While he was over there, he even helped negotiate the Treaty of Ghent to end the War of 1812. And eventually, he became James Monroe's Secretary of State. As Secretary of State, the man was an absolute powerhouse. He authored the Monroe Doctrine, formally declaring that the U.S. would resist European intervention in Latin America. He successfully pushed to acquire Florida, and he smoothed over Anglo-American relations by settling a really tricky border dispute in Oregon country. He is universally recognized as one of the most accomplished and successful diplomats in American history, hands down.
Part 2. Slavery in the Capitol.
So when the Adams family returned to Washington, D.C. in 1817, they stepped into a city where slavery was expanding rapidly and deeply embedded in everyday life. They bought a house at 244 F Street, a place previously occupied by President James Monroe. But let's look at the context here. The district was a booming hub for the domestic slave trade. The Adams home was completely surrounded by enslaved people, situated just a single block away from the Washington jail, a building that literally doubled as a prison and a slave pen. On top of that, despite his anti-slavery political stances, Adams was actively navigating high society life in what was essentially a slaveocracy. His close friends and neighbors owned enslaved people. He and his wife attended these incredibly lavish diplomatic events hosted by prominent slave-owning families, like the Taylors and the Calhouns. Imagine navigating these fancy parties, rubbing elbows with the elite, all while knowing the entire event was powered by the very institution he criticized. The whole social ecosystem he operated in was made entirely possible by enslaved labor.
Part 3. A Complicated Presidency.
Once he finally made it to the Oval Office, Adams had massive, sweeping visions for the country. He pushed hard for vast internal improvements, most notably a national road and a highly developed network of canals to connect the growing, sprawling nation. But unfortunately for Adams, Congress rejected almost all of these proposals. He was just too far ahead of his time, and his grand ambitions ended up being stifled by the harsh political realities of the 1820s.
But if we look a bit closer at his time in the White House, we really have to ask a difficult, honestly uncomfortable question, one that forces us to look right past his political rhetoric. Did John Quincy Adams use enslaved labor in the White House?
This is where the profound contradiction of his life really sits. We know he vehemently opposed slavery as a political issue. Yet, let's look at his personal household dynamics. While they were living in the White House, Louisa Catherine's niece and nephew lived with them, and when they moved in, they brought two enslaved people they had inherited from their father, Halsey and Rachel Clark. So, how exactly did Adams justify this? Well, the source text describes the situation as a relationship of convenience. Adams didn't actually go out and purchase enslaved people himself, but because Halsey and Rachel Clark were already there in the house, he didn't have to pay someone for their labor, and he actively avoided hiring additional wage-earning servants. So at the end of the day, he benefited directly from the institution he politically despised, simply because it was financially and logistically convenient to do so under his own roof. Part 4. The Congressional Crusader. Moving ahead to 1828, Andrew Jackson actually defeated Adams in his bid for re-election. But just 2 years after losing the highest office in the land, he did something incredibly rare for a former president. He ran for a seat in the U.S. House of Representatives. He won in 1830 and pivoted to what would become the most fiery, relentless chapter of his entire career. He spent his final 2 decades literally railing against slavery, the power of the slavocracy, and the gag rule that stifled debate on the issue in Congress. Southern lawmakers had implemented a strict gag rule to stop anyone from even bringing up anti-slavery petitions. Well, Adams made it his absolute personal mission to destroy that rule and force the conversation out into the light. Now, this is where his personality really shines through. He benefited heavily from what we might call the privilege of age. See, Southerners routinely threatened other Northern congressmen with actual physical violence to keep them quiet, but they couldn't exactly march over and beat up an elderly, highly respected former president. Adams knew this, and he enjoyed it immensely. He eagerly and quite gleefully exploited this privileged position to push boundaries that literally no one else in Congress dared to cross. His crusade wasn't just limited to Congress either. In 1841, an aging John Quincy Adams stepped right in front of the United States Supreme Court to argue the incredibly famous United States versus Amistad case. He successfully won the release of enslaved African captives who had mutinied aboard their ship, cementing his legacy as a truly formidable legal defender of human freedom. Part 5. A Final Act of Service. On February 21st, 1848, Adams literally collapsed at his desk. He suffered a stroke right on the floor of the House of Representatives, doing the exact work he loved. He was quickly carried into the Speaker's room inside the Capitol building, where he fell into a coma. 2 days later, on February 23rd, he passed away. He died exactly where he had spent almost his entire life, right in the halls of American government. So as we wrap up this explainer and look back at his incredible timeline from his childhood in the courts of Europe all the way to his dying breath in the U.S. Capitol, it leaves us with a really compelling, provocative question. How do we weigh a lifetime of unparalleled public service against the stark contradictions of his era? How do we reconcile his lifelong, fiery fight for the nation's highest ideals with the convenient compromises he made regarding enslaved labor right under his own roof? It's a question that doesn't just define John Quincy Adams, it really defines the early American story itself. Something to think about until next time.